They placed spike strips around my car just because I grew tomatoes in my driveway. But I discovered the one legal loophole the homeowner association president never saw coming. What would you do if your neighbors tried to confine you for growing your own food? Comment below where you're watching from. The police officer observed the metal spike strips surrounding my car in disbelief. And they did this because of crops? He asked, scratching his head. Tomatoes. Officer started with tomatoes. I said, pointing to my driveway. Planters never thought growing food would make me a prisoner in my own home. It all began 3 months ago when I lost my finance job. The pink slip came on a Tuesday along with the final paycheck that wouldn't cover next month's mortgage. That night, I stared at the $200 grocery receipt while eating a costly tomato salad and had an idea. The next day, I drove to Home Depot and bought plastic planters, soil, and vegetable seedlings. My driveway got 6 hours of perfect sunshine daily. Wasted space I could use to grow food and save money. Within a week, I had 2 neat rows of containers along both sides of my driveway with tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and herbs. My first harvest saved me $43 compared to store prices. I felt satisfied watching little green tomatoes grow larger each day. Some neighbors even stopped to chat, asking for gardening suggestions. Old Mr. Garcia from next door brought me unused tomato cages he wasn't using anymore. Then came the camera. Clicks. Patricia Wilson from across the street stood on her manicured lawn taking photos of my driveway garden. Her blonde bob didn't move in the breeze as she snapped picture after picture. Beautiful day, isn't it? I called out with a gentle wave. Patricia's smile was rigid. Just documenting some concerns for the community gathering, she replied, turning sharply and walking away in her tennis outfit. The evening, an email appeared in my inbox from Richard Thompson, president of Maple Creek Estates Homeowner Association. Attention homeowner, at 476 Oakwood Drive. Residential properties must maintain visual standards according to our community guidelines. Your driveway setup violates Code 15.3. Please remedy within 7 days. I immediately opened our homeowner association handbook, flipping through all 43 pages twice. Nothing explicitly prohibited container gardens anywhere on properties. Section 15.3 only mentioned keeping driveways clear of long-term storage items. These weren't storage items, they were actively growing food. The next morning, found a handwritten note taped to my mailbox. Gardens belong in backyards, not where everyone has to see them. Concerned neighbor. The cursive handwriting matched Patricia's flowing script from last year's Christmas card. When I took my garbage out later, Patricia and Richard stood talking at the corner. Richard pointed toward my house, shaking his head. Patricia nodded eagerly. They both grinned when they saw me looking. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived, citing my agricultural activities as inconsistent with our community's residential character. The letter threatened a $100 daily fine starting next week. My stomach tightened as I calculated my dwindling savings. That night, I researched homeowner association laws until learning about reasonable restrictions versus overreach. I printed the county's definition of landscaping, which specifically mentioned container gardening as allowed in residential zones. The next day, I walked the neighborhood taking photos of every rule violation I could find. Holiday decorations still up in April. Unapproved lawn ornaments. Basketball hoops, all technically against homeowner association rules, but ignored. Only my garden seemed to matter. I drafted a response to Richard, citing county regulations and pointing out inconsistent enforcement. I kept my tone polite but assertive. Before sending it, I knocked on Mr. Garcia's door. They are targeting you because Patricia wants to win the Neighborhood Beautification Award next month, he said, inviting me in for coffee. Her view from her front window includes your driveway. She's been complaining about eyesores to anyone who will listen. But it's just vegetables. I said I need to reduce expenses right now. Mr. Garcia nodded. Richard always sides with Patricia. Her husband plays golf with him every Sunday. He leaned forward. But they have made adversaries. The Johnsons moved out last year after being fined for their daughter's wheelchair ramp being the wrong shade of beige. I invited everyone over that evening. To my surprise, 8 neighbors showed up, each with stories about Richard and Patricia's selective enforcement of rules. "They only care about rules when it benefits them," said James, who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Richard built a shed too large, but the board granted him a special exception, and Patricia's koi pond required a permit, added Sophia, which was approved in record time. We agreed to attend the next homeowner association meeting together and challenged the board's methods. Strength in numbers seemed like our best approach. When everyone left, I researched selective enforcement of homeowner association rules and documented every inconsistency in our neighborhood with photographs and dates. I was building a case. The next morning, a landscaping truck parked in front of my house. Two men in uniforms approached my door. "Homeowner association sent us to remove unauthorized plantings," the taller one said, handing me a work order signed by Richard. "You do not have authorization to touch anything on my property," I replied firmly. "Please leave now." They looked at each other uncertainly. "We were told the resident had been notified," the second man said. "I have received notices, but I am contesting them as biased enforcement," I explained. "If you remove anything without my permission, it is destruction of private property." They eventually left, but an hour later received an email from Richard. "Your refusal to comply leaves us no choice but to pursue all legal remedies." That afternoon, while working from home, I noticed Patricia leading 3 women on a tour of the neighborhood. When they reached my house, Patricia pointed dramatically at my driveway, garden, and the women shook their heads in disapproval. That evening, another official letter arrived, this time a formal cease and desist warning legal action if my agricultural activities were not terminated within 48 hours. I called the county housing authority immediately and spoke with a clerk named Marcus. "Homeowner associations have power, but they are not above the law," Marcus explained. "I suggest you check if your community has any agricultural heritage protections in its original plan." "Agricultural heritage?" I asked. "Many developments here were built on former farmland," Marcus explained. "Some have special clauses protecting residents' rights to grow food, usually in the initial covenants." I thanked him and immediately drove to the county records office. Reaching it just before closing time, the clerk helped me locate my community's original documents from 1992. Flipping through dusty pages, my heart raced when I found Section 8. In accordance with County Agricultural Heritage Protection Act, homeowners retain the right to cultivate food-producing plants on their property, provided such cultivation does not create hazardous conditions. I took photos of every page with my phone, my hands shaking with excitement. This could change everything. Returning home, I found my newly planted containers had been doused with something that smelled like chemicals. All the plants were wilting and discolored. As I stood there stunned, Patricia drove by slowly, smiling and waving from her car window. I did not realize then that chemical sabotage was just the beginning of what she had planned. My jaw dropped when I saw what they were doing to my driveway. I was eating breakfast when I heard a strange scraping noise outside. I rushed to the window and could not believe my eyes. 2 men in bright yellow Maple Creek maintenance vests were installing metal strips with sharp spikes along both sides of my driveway. These were not just any barriers. They were actual spike strips that would shred my tires if I tried to drive over them. "Hey, stop right now," I yelled, running outside, still holding my coffee mug. The workers barely looked up. The older one with the gray beard mumbled, "Just following homeowner association orders." "Ma'am, nothing personal, orders for what, to trap me in my own home." My voice shook as I took out my phone and started recording. The younger worker at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "It is called property demarcation for violations. We are just doing our job." I immediately called the police, pacing back and forth behind my now imprisoned car. Officer Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, but his response made my stomach sink. "I understand. You are upset," he said, flipping through his notepad, "but this appears to be a civil matter between you and your homeowner association. They do have authority to mark property violations according to your community rules, but they have trapped my car. I cannot leave without destroying my tires." I pointed to the wicked-looking metal teeth gleaming in the morning sun. Officer Martinez frowned. "That does seem excessive. Have you tried contacting your homeowner association representative directly? I marched straight to Richard's house, my hands shaking with anger. I never got to his door, because Patricia appeared out of nowhere blocking my path in the middle of the street. Her perfectly highlighted hair didn't move an inch as she held up her phone, recording our encounter. Well, if it isn't Farmer Jones, she said with a smirk. Those spike strips must be quite inconvenient. This is illegal, I shouted, trying to keep my cool, but failing. You can't trap someone on their property. Patricia's eyes narrowed. You've been warned repeatedly about your vegetable disaster. The board voted unanimously last night. She waved a folder of papers. Those unsightly planters violate 3 separate homeowner association codes and lower all our property values. My sister is a real estate agent, and she says houses on your street are already getting lower offers. That's ridiculous, I said. We're in a housing boom, and my planters are neat and well-maintained. Farm belong in the country, not in Maple Creek Estates, she snapped. Remove those plants and we'll remove the barriers. Simple as that. Richard appeared behind her, arms crossed. We've had complaints from 7 different homeowners. This isn't personal, it's about maintaining standards. As they walked away, I heard Patricia laugh. Maybe she can grow enough to feed herself, since she won't be able to drive to the grocery store. Felt trapped and desperate. My doctor's appointment was tomorrow, and I needed to pick up my mom from her physical therapy this afternoon. I called 5 different tire shops, but the spikes were designed to cause maximum damage. No temporary fix would work. That night, instead of crying, I got angry and then got smart. I drove my riding lawnmower, carefully avoiding the spikes, to my neighbor Ellie's house and borrowed her car. Then I headed downtown to the county records office, which stayed open late on Wednesdays. The clerk looked bored as I requested the original subdivision plans and covenants for Maple Creek Estates. Property dispute? She asked, not looking up. You could say that, I replied. 3 hours later, surrounded by dusty documents and property maps, I found it. The single piece of information the home owner association had either overlooked or deliberately hidden. My hands trembled as I made copies, my mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a way out of my current situation. This could change everything about how our neighborhood was run. I drove home in Ellie's car. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the spike strips that surrounded my driveway. But for the first time all day, I smiled. Richard and Patricia had no idea what was coming their way. They installed what around your driveway? Sarah Jenkins nearly spat out her coffee when I showed her the photos of the spike strips. I'd called her first thing in the morning. She was the best property rights lawyer in the county, and I'd found her number on a community board at the records office. Strips like the police used to stop criminals, I explained, sliding the manila folder of documents across her desk. They're basically holding me hostage until I remove my vegetable garden. Sarah adjusted her glasses and examined the papers I'd found. After 10 minutes of silent reading, she started laughing, not a small chuckle, but a full-blown laugh that made her assistant peek in to see what was happening. In 15 years of practicing homeowner association law, I've never seen a board make such a massive mistake, she said, tapping the oldest document in the pile. Your entire subdivision was built on land designated under the County Agricultural Heritage Protection Act of 1998. It was originally the Hender family farm, and when they sold it to developers, they included a special covenant. She pointed to a paragraph written in dense legal language. This says all homeowners retain the explicit right to grow food on their property, and that right shall not be infringed by any future homeowner association or governing body. This can't be overridden by homeowner association bylaws they created later. My heart pounded with hope. So my garden is completely legal. More than legal, it's specially protected, Sarah said, already typing on her computer. And those spike strips, that's unlawful detention, possibly even criminal. We're filing an emergency injunction right now. By noon, the paperwork was submitted to the county court. Sarah suggested I document everything, so I posted a single photo of the spike strips on my neighborhood social media group with a simple caption: is this how homeowner associations should solve disputes about vegetable gardens? The post exploded by 3 o'clock. A reporter from Channel 7 News knocked on my door, followed by 2 more news vans. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors I'd never even met sharing their own homeowner association horror stories were live. At Maple Creek Estates, where a homeowner claims the homeowner association installed dangerous spike strips around her car all because she grew tomatoes and decorative planters, the reporter announced into the camera on my front lawn. I was explaining the situation when a black SUV screeched to a halt across the street. Patricia practically flew out the passenger door with Richard right behind her. Both looking like they'd swallowed lemons. Turn those cameras off, Richard shouted, storming across my lawn. This is a private neighborhood matter. The reporter, sensing drama, signaled her cameraman to keep rolling. Mr. Thompson, as homeowner association president, did you authorize the installation of these tire puncturing devices? Patricia pushed in front of the microphone. This is completely one-sided. She's violated multiple community standards with that eyesore. She pointed dramatically at my neat row of planter boxes where cherry tomatoes ripened in the sun. She pointed dramatically at my neat row of planter boxes where cherry tomatoes ripened in the sun. Those eyesores help feed my family, I said calmly, knowing my composed response would contrast with their anger. And nothing in the homeowner association guidelines prohibits container gardens. The cameras followed as Patricia and Richard retreated, then marched up my walkway once the news crew left for their next appointment. Patricia's perfectly manicured nail jabbed toward my face. You're making us look like monsters on social media, she hissed, her face flushed. You installed spike strips around my car? I reminded her evenly. How would you describe that? Richard stepped forward, lowering his voice to sound reasonable. Look, we can resolve this. Quietly remove your garden. We'll remove the strips and forget the violations. No lawyers, no media circus. I took a deep breath and pulled out the copy Sarah had prepared. I have a counter offer, I replied, handing them the agricultural heritage documents. Remove the strips immediately, or I continue with my lawsuit, which now includes false imprisonment, harassment, and violation of protected agricultural rights. Their faces transformed as they read. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization of their massive mistake. But instead of backing down, Richard's face hardened. He snatched the papers and tore them in half. We'll see what our lawyers say about your little farm loophole. The homeowner association has a $300,000 legal defense fund, and we're not afraid to use it. Do you have that kind of money? As they stormed off, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Judge Watkins is reviewing our emergency motion right now. Stay strong. Tried to focus on watering my plants that evening, but worry gnawed at me. What if the judge sided with the homeowner association? What if Richard was right about their legal fund outlasting my savings? At 2:17 a.m., my security camera's alert woke me up. The motion-activated floodlights revealed a figure hunched by my garden. Patricia's husband Tom, wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm night, garden shears glinting in his hands on my phone screen. I watched in disbelief as he systematically cut through every irrigation line connecting my self-watering system, then slashed the soil bags I'd stored for next season. Called the police immediately, and this time, they took it seriously. Officer Martinez arrived within minutes, catching Tom still on my property. The look of shock on his face when the police car lights flashed was something I'll never forget. Mrs. Walker claims you've been harassing her, and now we find you vandalizing her property at 2 a.m. Officer Martinez said, making notes as Tom stammered excuses. My husband was just checking for rats around her garden. Patricia insisted, having rushed over in her silk bathrobe. Those vegetable plants attract vermin. Officer Martinez picked up the garden shears. With these, ma'am, we have the whole incident on security video. With these, ma'am, we have the whole incident on security video. As Tom was escorted to the police car for questioning, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows. Dave from down the street gave me a thumbs up. Ellie waved encouragingly. For the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. My phone chimed with an email from Sarah. Emergency hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. We've got them cornered. As dawn broke over my trapped car and damaged garden, felt strangely calm. The homeowner association had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. Tomorrow would change everything, not just for me, but for our entire community. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Watkins entered, her stern expression giving nothing away. My stomach twisted into knots when I spotted Richard and Patricia sitting confidently with their attorney, a sleek man in an expensive suit, who kept whispering in Richard's ear. They had 3 people on their side of the room. I was surprised to see over 20 of my neighbors had shown up to support me, filling the benches behind Sarah and me. Before we begin, Judge Watkins said, adjusting her glasses, I want to make something very clear. I reviewed the evidence until midnight, and I am deeply troubled by what I've seen. Richard's lawyer stood up smoothly. Your Honor, if I may, you may not. Judge Watkins cut him off. Mr. Parker, I've read your brief now. Want to see these spike strips for myself. The courtroom screens lit up with my photos and video. Several people gasped at the images of the metal teeth surrounding my driveway. Mr. Thompson, the judge addressed Richard directly. As homeowner association president, did you authorize these devices to be installed? Richard stood, straightening his tie. Yes, Your Honor, but they were simply property markers to indicate a violation zone. Not meant to. They are designed to puncture tires. Judge Watkins interrupted. The maintenance company's invoice specifically lists them as vehicle deterrent spike systems. Did you or did you not intend to prevent Miss Walker from using her vehicle? When Richard hesitated, Patricia jumped up. She was breaking the rules. We gave her multiple warnings about that garden. The judge's gavel banged sharply. Mrs. Davis, you are not recognized to speak. Please sit down. Sarah presented the agricultural heritage documents next, explaining how they predated and superseded any homeowner association regulations. Richard's lawyer argued that modern community standards should take precedence, but his voice faltered when Judge Watkins held up the original covenant. This language is crystal clear, she said. The right to grow food on one's property is explicitly protected. Furthermore, there's nothing in the current homeowner association guidelines that specifically prohibits container gardening. Then came the security footage from last night. Tom Davis cutting my irrigation lines at 2:17 a.m. Patricia's face turned crimson as her husband's actions played on the screens. Mr. Davis has already been charged with criminal vandalism. Officer Martinez testified he admitted Mrs. Davis asked him to do something about the garden situation. After just 40 minutes of arguments, Judge Watkins delivered her ruling. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. She announced that the Maple Creek Estates Homeowner Association actions constitute unlawful detention, harassment, and violation of protected property rights. Her voice hardened. Installing physical barriers preventing a homeowner from using their vehicle is particularly troubling. This court doesn't look kindly on vigilante enforcement tactics. My eyes filled with tears as she continued. The homeowner association is ordered to remove the spike strips immediately within the hour. They will pay damages of $155,000, reimburse all legal fees, and repair all vandalized garden equipment. She looked directly at Richard. Additionally, I'm mandating new homeowner association board elections within 30 days, supervised by a court-appointed observer. Richard's face went from red to white. Patricia buried her face in her hands. Your Honor, Richard's attorney began. We intend to appeal. That is your right, Judge. Watkins nodded. However, the removal order and election requirement will not be stayed during any appeal. And Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Davis, if there is any further harassment of Miss Walker, this court will not hesitate to find you in contempt. Are we clear? They nodded silently. As we left the courtroom, Sarah squeezed my arm. This is a bigger win than you might realize. This case creates a precedent for thousands of homeowners in similar situations. When I turned onto my street that afternoon, I couldn't believe my eyes. A crowd had gathered outside my house, and at first I feared the worst. Had Patricia organized some kind of protest? But as I got closer, I realized they were my neighbors, cheering and clapping. The maintenance crew was already removing the spike strips under Officer Martinez's watchful eye. Dave from down the block approached my car window. We watched the hearing on the court's livestream. He grinned. You stood up for all of us. He handed me a beautiful ceramic planter painted with sunflowers for our neighborhood's defender. Tears filled my eyes again as Ellie and her husband unveiled a handmade sign. They'd created Maple Creek Community Gardens, growing together. They collected signatures from over 50 neighbors who wanted to start a shared garden space in the unused land behind the neighborhood playground. We never knew about that agricultural heritage clause, Ellie explained. It applies to the whole subdivision, just your property. We've been wanting community garden space for years. Over the next few weeks, something amazing happened. My little victory rippled outward in ways I never expected. Richard resigned from the homeowner association board completely and put his house up for sale. The new board, led by Dave and Mrs. Johnson from Maple Street, approved the community garden project unanimously. Even more surprising were the visitors from other neighborhoods. We heard about what happened here. A woman from Oakry Estates told me as she admired my thriving tomato plants. Our homeowner association has been just as bad. Can you tell us how you found that original covenant? I expanded my own garden, adding a small sign, Community Harvest. Take what you need. The children from the neighborhood started stopping by after school, curious about how food grows. Mrs. Gonzalez, who had initially signed Patricia's complaint petition, sheepishly asked for gardening tips. When her granddaughter became fascinated with my strawberry plants, I was wrong, she admitted, watching her granddaughter carefully water the seedlings. I'd given them. Patricia kept saying these plants would bring down our property values, but my daughter's family is now considering moving here because of the community garden. Patricia still lives across the street, but now crosses to the other side when she sees me coming. Tom completed his community service hours by ironically helping build raised beds for the new community garden space. He turned out to be quite skilled at carpentry when not sneaking around cutting irrigation lines. The biggest surprise came 3 months later. I was invited to speak at the County Planning Commission about urban agriculture rights. 3 nearby homeowner association communities wanted help establishing their own community garden spaces. Inspired by our story, your case has become something of a legend. The commissioner told me people are demanding to know what rights they actually have under these restrictive homeowner associations. This morning, as I harvested the last tomatoes of the season from my driveway plants, I noticed faint marks still visible on the concrete where the spike strips had been. I couldn't help but smile. They're a reminder that standing up for what's right can change more than just your own situation. My phone chimed with a text from Sarah. Guess what? State legislature just introduced the Homeowner Food Freedom Act, and they mentioned your case by name. I looked at my flourishing garden, then at the community garden beyond where neighbors worked together among rows of vegetables and flowers. Sometimes the most beautiful harvests aren't the ones you can eat, but the connections and changes that grow from standing your ground. And it all started because one small garden made Patricia Davis so angry she couldn't see past her own rulebook long enough to check the actual law. As my grandfather used to say, before you dig up someone else's garden, make sure you know whose land you're standing on.